In the autumn of 1936, a young woman stood on the deck of a steamship bound for England, watching the California coastline disappear into the fog. She was 28 years old. She was one of the most bankable stars in American cinema, and she was running away from the most powerful men in Hollywood. Her name was Bette Davis, and what she was about to do would be called madness, career suicide, professional ruin. The studio executives who controlled her life would laugh at her audacity. The press would mock her ingratitude. The courts would rule against her. But in losing that battle, she would help win a war. A war for the soul of American cinema. A war that would take decades to resolve, but would begin with one woman's refusal to be silent. This is the story of how Bette Davis sued Warner Brothers Pictures, lost everything, and changed Hollywood forever. To understand what Bette Davis did, you must first understand the world she lived in. Hollywood in the 1930s was not the glamorous paradise we imagine today. It was a factory system built on a foundation of iron contracts and absolute control. And that system had been carefully constructed over decades to ensure that the studios, and only the studios, held all the power. The major studios, Warner Brothers, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Paramount Pictures, RKO, Radio Pictures, 20th Century Fox, these were not just production companies. They were vertically integrated monopolies that controlled every aspect of the motion picture business. They owned the cameras and the sound equipment. They owned the back lots where the sets were built and the warehouses where the costumes were stored. They owned the laboratories where film was developed and the editing rooms where it was cut together. And crucially, they owned the theaters where movies were shown to the public. If you wanted to see a movie in 1936, you almost certainly saw it in a theater owned by one of the major studios. This gave them unprecedented leverage. They could guarantee distribution for their own films while blocking independent productions from reaching audiences. They could dictate terms to theater owners who weren't part of their chain. They had created, in effect, a closed system that was nearly impossible to compete with. But the most important thing the studios owned was not property or equipment. It was people. The contract system that governed actors' lives in the 1930s was a masterpiece of legal control. When you signed with a major studio, you typically signed what was called 7-year option contract. The term option was crucial. It meant that every 6 months or every year, depending on the specific contract, the studio had the option to either continue employing you or to drop you. You, however, had no such option. You were bound for the full 7 years. The studio could end the relationship at any time. You could not. During those 7 years, the studio controlled virtually every aspect of your professional life. They decided which films you would appear in, which roles you would play, which directors you would work with. They decided when you would work and when you would rest. They could loan you out to other studios, pocketing the difference if they charged the borrowing studio more than they were paying you. You had no say in any of these decisions. But the true genius of a system, or its true evil, depending on your perspective, lay in the suspension clause. If you refused an assignment, if you turned down a role the studio wanted you to play, they had the right to suspend you without pay. And during that suspension, time stopped. If you were suspended for 3 months, those 3 months did not count toward your 7-year obligation. You owed the studio 3 more months of service. Your 7-year contract could easily become 8 years, 9 years, 10 years. There was no upper limit. As long as the studio kept exercising its options, you were bound. And while you were suspended, you could not work for anyone else. The studio still owned your services. You simply were not being paid for them. You could not appear in another studio's film. You could not perform on stage. You could not even appear on radio in most cases. You sat at home, unpaid, watching your career stall, while the studio that had suspended you continued making money from your previous work. Some actors accepted this system as the price of fame. Others chafed under it, but saw no alternative. A very few tried to fight it. They were almost always crushed. The studios justified this control by pointing to the enormous investments they made in their contract players. They paid for acting coaches, dancing lessons, singing instructors. They paid for dental work, plastic surgery, personal trainers. They created elaborate publicity campaigns, arranged magazine covers, orchestrated public appearances. They argued, not without some validity, that they had transformed unknown youngsters into valuable stars, and they deserved to recoup that investment. But there was another reason the studios held on to their control so fiercely. They were afraid. Afraid of what would happen if actors gained the power to choose. Afraid that salary demands would skyrocket. Afraid that production schedules would collapse if performers could simply say no. Afraid, ultimately, of losing the machine they had built. Into this world came Ruth Elizabeth Davis, born in 1908 in Lowell, Massachusetts. She did not have the background typical of Hollywood stars. She was not a beauty queen discovered at a drugstore counter. She was not a dancer plucked from a chorus line. She had not grown up in California, soaking in the sunshine and dreaming of movies. She was a New England girl, the daughter of a divorced mother who had raised two daughters alone during an era when divorce was still scandalous. She had studied at the John Murray Anderson Drama School in New York. She had worked in summer stock theater. She had performed on Broadway. She came to Hollywood in 1930 with theatrical training and serious ambitions. She wanted to be an actress, in the fullest sense of that word. Not a personality, not a commodity. An artist who could inhabit different characters, explore different emotions, challenge both herself and her audience. The studios did not quite know what to make of her. Her first screen test for Universal Pictures was, by all accounts, a disaster. The camera did not love her the way it loved Jean Harlow or Greta Garbo. Her features were strong rather than delicate. Her manner was intense rather than alluring. Carl Laemmle, the head of Universal, reportedly took one look at her and asked his assistant who had sent her. When told she was a contract player, he is said to have remarked that she had about as much sex appeal as Slim Somerville, a comic character actor who played rural buffoons. Universal put her in a handful of forgettable films and then dropped her contract. She was 22 years old, 3,000 miles from home, and apparently finished in Hollywood before she had really begun. But she had caught the attention of someone at Warner Brothers. Perhaps it was her intensity on screen. Perhaps it was the intelligence visible in her face. Perhaps it was simply that the studio needed to fill out its roster of contract players, and she was available at a low price. Whatever the reason, Warner Brothers signed her in December 1932 to a standard 7-year contract at $350 per week. It was not glamorous work at first. Warner Brothers in the early 1930s was not Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, with its prestige productions and glossy finish. Warner Brothers made films fast and cheap. They specialized in gangster pictures, social problem films, musicals featuring elaborate Busby Berkeley production numbers, and an endless stream of program pictures, B-movies designed to fill the bottom half of double features. Davis was used the way all contract players were used. She appeared in whatever needed filling out. In her first 18 months at the studio, she made 14 films. She played a store clerk, a secretary, a singer, a society girl, a wronged woman, a dangerous woman, an innocent woman. Some of the films were good. Most were not. But she worked constantly, learning her craft in front of the camera, developing the technique that would later make her one of the greatest actresses in Hollywood history. The studio heads noticed her, but they did not quite know how to market her. She was not glamorous enough for romantic leads. She was too refined for working-class roles. She was too intelligent for the blonde bombshell parts. She existed in a strange middle ground, talented but unclassifiable. And then came the opportunity that would change everything. In 1934, RKO Radio Pictures was preparing to film of Human Bondage, based on the novel by W. Somerset Maugham. The story centered on a sensitive, club-footed medical student who becomes obsessed with Mildred Rogers, a cruel, shallow, manipulative waitress who destroys his life through calculated selfishness. The role of Mildred was small but showy, the kind of part that could make a career if performed with sufficient courage. Every actress in Hollywood had turned it down. It was too unsympathetic, too ugly, too risky. Audiences would hate the character, and by extension, they would hate the actress playing her. It seemed like professional suicide. Bette Davis begged Jack Warner to loan her out for the role. Warner was skeptical. He did not understand why his contract player wanted to make herself repulsive on screen. But RKO was willing to pay, and Warner Brothers had no immediate use for Davis, so he agreed. Probably he thought she was making a mistake. Possibly he did not care. What Davis did with the role shocked everyone who saw it. She made herself physically unattractive. She played Mildred with a cockney whine that grated on the ear. She showed the character's pettiness, her vindictiveness, her capacity for casual cruelty. And underneath it all, she suggested something more, a desperate emptiness, a bottomless need that could never be filled. It was not a sympathetic performance. It was barely even a likable one, but it was utterly, devastatingly truthful. Critics were stunned. Audiences were repelled and fascinated in equal measure. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences did not nominate her for an Oscar, Officially, it was said because write-in votes were prohibited that year, though many suspected the real reason was that Academy members could not bring themselves to reward such an uncompromising, uncomfortable performance. But within the industry, everyone understood that something significant had happened. Here was an actress willing to strip away every trace of vanity, every need to be loved by the audience, in service of the truth of a character. Here was someone operating at a different level. Warner Brothers took notice. They began giving her better roles. Not consistently, the studio system did not work that way, but more frequently. In 1935, they cast her in Dangerous, playing a self-destructive stage actress who finds redemption through the love of a good man. The role was calculated, a vehicle designed specifically to win her the Oscar she had been denied for Of Human Bondage. The film itself was melodramatic and not particularly distinguished. But Davis elevated the material through sheer force of talent. At the Academy Awards ceremony in March 1936, Bette Davis accepted the Golden Statuette for Best Actress. She was 27 years old. She had been in Hollywood for 6 years. She had worked in over 40 films. And now, finally, she had reached the pinnacle of her profession. She believed, naively perhaps, that winning an Oscar meant she had earned the right to have a voice in her career. She believed that the studio would now treat her as a partner rather than as property. She believed that her success gave her some measure of power. She was wrong. Jack Warner did not see the Academy Award as changing the fundamental relationship between studio and star. To him, Davis was still a contract player, still an employee who could be assigned to whatever role the studio deemed appropriate. If anything, her Oscar made her more valuable as a commodity, which meant the studio should work her harder, not consult her more. After her Oscar win, Davis was immediately assigned to a series of scripts she found beneath her abilities. The Golden Arrow, a frivolous romantic comedy. Satan Met a Lady, a badly written mystery that squandered a good premise. These were not films designed to challenge her or showcase her talent. They were films designed to capitalize on her name, to make quick money while her Oscar win was still fresh in the public's mind. Davis began to refuse them. Not belligerently, not arrogantly, but firmly. She would go to the studio executives and explain that these roles would damage her career, that audiences who had seen her win an Academy Award would be disappointed by such lightweight material. She argued that better scripts would make more money in the long run, that protecting her reputation protected the studio's investment in her. The studio did not see it that way. Each refusal triggered the suspension clause in her contract. She was sent home without pay. The clock stopped ticking on her 7-year obligation. She sat in her house, watching opportunities pass to other actresses, watching her momentum dissipate, while Warner Brothers calmly waited for her to capitulate. She always did capitulate, eventually. She had no choice. She had no income. She could not work elsewhere. She had to return to the studio and make whatever film they assigned her, no matter how much she despised the material. The suspensions accumulated over 1936. Weeks became months. Davis could feel her career slipping away. She was in her late 20s, in the prime years for a Hollywood actress, and she was being systematically sidelined by the very studio that owed its success to her work. Jack Warner reportedly found her protests amusing. He was a man who had grown up in poverty, who had started his career showing films in small-town Nickelodeons, who had built Warner Brothers through ruthlessness and instinct. He had survived the transition from silent films to sound. He had navigated the Depression when other studios went bankrupt. He was not about to be dictated to by an actress, no matter how talented. Some reports suggest that during this period, Warner made dismissive comments about Davis, suggesting she thought too highly of her own intelligence, that she had delusions about her importance to the studio. Whether these specific remarks are accurate or apocryphal, they capture the attitude of the studio system toward actors who challenged the established order. You were supposed to be grateful. You were supposed to remember your place. And then, in the summer of 1936, everything changed. A European producer named Ludovic Toplitz approached Davis with an offer to make 2 films in England. The projects were sophisticated, artistic, the kind of work she had been begging Warner Brothers to give her. The money was good. The creative freedom was real. There was only one problem. Accepting the offer would mean breaking her contract with Warner Brothers. It would mean open rebellion against the studio system. It would mean war. Davis knew what she was risking. She knew that Warner Brothers would sue her. She knew that she would probably lose. She knew that even if she won, the other studios might blacklist her for daring to challenge the system. She could very well be ending her career. But she also knew that if she did not do this, if she did not stand up now, she would spend the next several years, possibly longer, given the suspensions, making films that diminished her, playing roles that wasted her talent, trapped in a golden cage, with no escape. She made her decision. In August 1936, she sailed for England. The news hit Hollywood like a thunderclap. Contract players did not simply leave. They did not walk away from major studios. The system was not designed to allow such things. And yet Bette Davis had done exactly that. Warner Brothers moved quickly. They filed suit in London's High Court of Justice, seeking an injunction to prevent Davis from working for anyone else and to compel her return to Hollywood. The case was titled Warner Brothers Pictures Incorporated vs. Davis. The studio sent their top lawyers, men experienced in defending corporate interests against individual challenges. Davis had almost no money to fight them. The English attorneys who took her case did so largely because they believed in the principle at stake, not because they expected to be well compensated. She was facing one of the most powerful corporations in the world on foreign soil with minimal resources. The case began in October 1936 and immediately became a sensation in the British press. The newspapers loved the story. Here was a beautiful American film star defying the Hollywood machine, fighting for her freedom in the very city where Shakespeare had once written about liberty and justice. The tabloids ran photographs of Davis arriving at court, always impeccably dressed, always composed. The more serious papers debated the legal and moral issues at stake. But the coverage was not uniformly sympathetic. Many columnists characterized Davis as ungrateful. She had been paid well for her work. She had achieved fame and success. And now she was biting the hand that fed her, as one paper put it, acting as though she were too good for the people who had made her a star. She believed, naively perhaps, that winning an Oscar meant she had earned the right to have a voice in her career. She believed that the studio would now treat her as a partner rather than as property. She believed that her success gave her some measure of power. She was wrong. Jack Warner did not see the Academy Award as changing the fundamental relationship between studio and star. To him, Davis was still a contract player, still an employee who could be assigned to whatever role the studio deemed appropriate. If anything, her Oscar made her more valuable as a commodity, which meant the studio should work her harder, not consult her more. After her Oscar win, Davis was immediately assigned to a series of scripts she found beneath her abilities. The Golden Arrow, a frivolous romantic comedy. Satan Met a Lady, a badly written mystery that squandered a good premise. These were not films designed to challenge her or showcase her talent. They were films designed to capitalize on her name, to make quick money while her Oscar win was still fresh in the public's mind. Davis began to refuse them. Not belligerently, not arrogantly, but firmly. She would go to the studio executives and explain that these roles would damage her career, that audiences who had seen her win an Academy Award would be disappointed by such lightweight material. She argued that better scripts would make more money in the long run, that protecting her reputation protected the studio's investment in her. The studio did not see it that way. Each refusal triggered the suspension clause in her contract. She was sent home without pay. The clock stopped ticking on her 7-year obligation. She sat in her house, watching opportunities pass to other actresses, watching her momentum dissipate, while Warner Brothers calmly waited for her to capitulate. She always did capitulate, eventually. She had no choice. She had no income. She could not work elsewhere. She had to return to the studio and make whatever film they assigned her, no matter how much she despised the material. The suspensions accumulated over 1936. Weeks became months. Davis could feel her career slipping away. She was in her late 20s, in the prime years for a Hollywood actress, and she was being systematically sidelined by the very studio that owed its success to her work. Jack Warner reportedly found her protests amusing. He was a man who had grown up in poverty, who had started his career showing films in small-town Nickelodeons, who had built Warner Brothers through ruthlessness and instinct. He had survived the transition from silent films to sound. He had navigated the Depression when other studios went bankrupt. He was not about to be dictated to by an actress, no matter how talented. Some reports suggest that during this period, Warner made dismissive comments about Davis, suggesting she thought too highly of her own intelligence, that she had delusions about her importance to the studio. Whether these specific remarks are accurate or apocryphal, they capture the attitude of the studio system toward actors who challenged the established order. You were supposed to be grateful. You were supposed to remember your place. And then, in the summer of 1936, everything changed. A European producer named Ludovic Toplitz approached Davis with an offer to make 2 films in England. The projects were sophisticated, artistic, the kind of work she had been begging Warner Brothers to give her. The money was good. The creative freedom was real. There was only one problem. Accepting the offer would mean breaking her contract with Warner Brothers. It would mean open rebellion against the studio system. It would mean war. Davis knew what she was risking. She knew that Warner Brothers would sue her. She knew that she would probably lose. She knew that even if she won, the other studios might blacklist her for daring to challenge the system. She could very well be ending her career. But she also knew that if she did not do this, if she did not stand up now, she would spend the next several years, possibly longer, given the suspensions, making films that diminished her, playing roles that wasted her talent, trapped in a golden cage, with no escape. She made her decision. In August 1936, she sailed for England. The news hit Hollywood like a thunderclap. Contract players did not simply leave. They did not walk away from major studios. The system was not designed to allow such things. And yet Bette Davis had done exactly that. Warner Brothers moved quickly. They filed suit in London's High Court of Justice, seeking an injunction to prevent Davis from working for anyone else and to compel her return to Hollywood. The case was titled Warner Brothers Pictures Incorporated vs. Davis. The studio sent their top lawyers, men experienced in defending corporate interests against individual challenges. Davis had almost no money to fight them. The English attorneys who took her case did so largely because they believed in the principle at stake, not because they expected to be well compensated. She was facing one of the most powerful corporations in the world on foreign soil with minimal resources. The case began in October 1936 and immediately became a sensation in the British press. The newspapers loved the story. Here was a beautiful American film star defying the Hollywood machine, fighting for her freedom in the very city where Shakespeare had once written about liberty and justice. The tabloids ran photographs of Davis arriving at court, always impeccably dressed, always composed. The more serious papers debated the legal and moral issues at stake. But the coverage was not uniformly sympathetic. Many columnists characterized Davis as ungrateful. She had been paid well for her work. She had achieved fame and success. And now she was biting the hand that fed her, as one paper put it, acting as though she were too good for the people who had made her a star. The trial itself was a study in contrasts. Warner Brothers lawyers were polished, prepared, armed with thick briefing books and precedents from English contract law. They presented their case methodically. Bette Davis had signed a contract of her own free will. She had been compensated generously for her services, far more than the average worker could dream of earning. She had agreed to certain terms, including the studio's right to assign her to films and to suspend her if she refused. She was now attempting to violate that contract because she wanted more money or more control, or simply because she had changed her mind. But contracts, the lawyers argued, meant something. They were the foundation of commerce, the basis of trust in business relationships. If Miss Davis could simply walk away because she was unhappy, what would prevent any employee from doing the same? What would happen to the stability that allowed businesses to function? The argument was logical, even compelling. And it sidestepped the fundamental question of whether the contract itself was just. Davis's lawyers tried to argue that her contract amounted to involuntary servitude, a form of bondage that no civilized legal system should enforce. They pointed out that the contract gave Warner Brothers complete control over her professional life for 7 years or longer, while giving her no reciprocal power. The studio could suspend her indefinitely, stopping the clock on her obligation, effectively extending her servitude for as long as they chose. She could not work for anyone else during these suspensions. She could not practice her profession. She was trapped. This, her lawyers argued, was not a normal employment contract between equal parties. This was a one-sided instrument of control that violated basic principles of fairness and human dignity. English courts, they suggested, should not enforce such contracts, regardless of what the letter of the law might say. It was a bold argument, perhaps even a noble one, but it faced a fundamental problem. The contract was legal. Davis had signed it. And English contract law, like American contract law, rested on the principle that competent adults were bound by agreements they freely entered into. The trial lasted several days. Davis sat in the courtroom each day, listening to lawyers dissect her career, her choices, her motivations. She heard her salary quoted as evidence of her good fortune. She heard her refusals characterized as petulance. She heard herself described as a commodity that Warner Brothers had invested in and now had the right to control. The British press filled the courtroom. Reporters scribbled notes. Photographers waited outside to capture her arrival and departure. The whole affair had taken on the quality of theater, which was perhaps inevitable, given that it concerned one of the world's most famous actresses fighting for her freedom against one of the world's most powerful corporations. On October 14, 1937, Justice Branson delivered his ruling. He sided with Warner Brothers on every significant point. The contract, he found, was valid and enforceable. Miss Davis had signed it freely. She had been paid well for her services. The terms might seem harsh, but they were not illegal. The studio had the right to assign her to films and to suspend her if she refused. She was legally bound to honor her commitment. He ordered her to return to Warner Brothers. He ordered her to cease any attempts to work for other employers. And he ordered her to pay the studio's legal costs, a sum that amounted to thousands of pounds, money she simply did not have. She had lost completely. The newspapers reported the verdict with varying degrees of sympathy. Some praised her courage even in defeat, noting that she had stood up for a principle and fought with dignity. Others suggested she had gotten what she deserved for challenging the natural order of the film industry, for being ungrateful to the studio that had made her a star. In Hollywood, the reaction was mixed. Some executives were pleased that an upstart actress had been put in her place. Others were quietly uncomfortable with the publicity the case had generated, with the way it had laid bare the mechanics of studio control for the general public to examine. Jack Warner publicly accepted Davis's surrender with magnanimity. He released a statement saying that Warner Brothers bore no ill will toward Miss Davis, that she was a valued member of the studio family, and that they looked forward to her return. He suggested that the whole affair had been a misunderstanding, that Miss Davis had been poorly advised by people who did not have her best interests at heart. Privately, according to some accounts, Warner and other studio executives had been amused throughout the trial. They had never believed that an actress, any actress, could truly threaten their power. The outcome confirmed what they had always known. The studios held all the cards. The contract system was unbreakable. But something unexpected was happening, something the studio executives did not fully recognize yet. The public had watched this trial unfold. They had seen a young woman stand up to a corporate giant. They had seen her fight for her dignity and her artistic freedom. They had seen her lose with grace. And they had seen, in vivid detail, exactly what a Hollywood contract looked like, the suspension clauses, the unilateral control, the years that could be added at the studio's whim. Many people, both inside and outside the film industry, found those terms troubling. The word slavery had been used during the trial, and while that might have seemed hyperbolic, after all, Davis was well paid and lived comfortably. There was nevertheless something disturbing about a system that could prevent a person from working in their chosen profession, that could extend their obligation indefinitely, that could control so many aspects of their life. Seeds had been planted. Questions had been raised. And though it would take years for those seeds to grow into real change, the conversation had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. Bette Davis returned to Hollywood in late 1937, financially ruined and legally defeated. She had lost her case. She had lost her money. She had been publicly humiliated. By all logic, her career should have been over. But Warner Brothers found themselves in an unexpected position. They had won in court, but they had not won in the court of public opinion. Davis had become something more than just a contract player. She had become a symbol of courage, of artistic integrity, of the individual standing against the system. And symbols, the studio realized, had value. Moreover, there was a practical consideration. If they destroyed Davis completely, if they punished her so severely that her career never recovered, they would only generate more sympathy for her and more criticism of the studio system. Better to be magnanimous in victory, to show that Warner Brothers was not the villain some had made them out to be. So they began, quietly, to give her better scripts. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, Davis noticed that the assignments she was receiving had more weight, more substance. The roles were more complex. The scripts were better written. The directors were more talented. In 1938, she was cast in Jezebel, a prestige production set in New Orleans before the Civil War. The film told the story of Julie Marsden, a headstrong Southern belle who defies convention by wearing a scandalous red dress to a formal ball, loses the man she loves through her own pride and selfishness, and ultimately finds redemption through sacrifice during a yellow fever epidemic. It was exactly the kind of role Davis had been fighting for. Julie was complex, flawed, fascinating, a character who made terrible mistakes but remained sympathetic because her emotions were so painfully real. The script was intelligent. The director, William Wyler, was a perfectionist who pushed her harder than almost any director she had worked with. The production values were high. This was not a program picture rushed out to fill theaters. This was a film that Warner Brothers expected to be taken seriously. Davis threw herself into the role with an intensity that amazed everyone on set. Wyler, a notoriously demanding director, made her repeat scenes dozens of times, pushing her to find new layers, new shadings. She did not complain. She had fought too hard for this opportunity to waste it. The film was released in March 1938 to strong reviews and good box office. Critics praised Davis's performance, noting that she had brought depth and nuance to what could have been a one-dimensional character. She made Julie Marsden's pride believable, her suffering real, her redemption earned. At the Academy Awards ceremony in February 1939, Bette Davis won her second Oscar for Best Actress. Standing on that stage, holding the statuette, she was gracious and professional. She thanked Warner Brothers. She thanked William Wyler. She thanked her fellow cast members. She did not mention the trial. She did not mention the suspensions or the struggles or the year she had spent fighting for the right to do work like this. She did not need to. Everyone in that room knew the story. Everyone understood that this Oscar, this role, this moment, it had been earned not just through talent, but through defiance. The years that followed were the most productive of Davis's career. Warner Brothers continued to give her strong material. She made Dark Victory in 1939, playing a socialite dying of a brain tumor with a mixture of courage and vulnerability that moved audiences to tears. She made The Letter in 1940, playing a woman who commits murder and lies about it with chilling calculation. She made The Little Foxes on Loan to Samuel Goldwyn in 1941, playing a ruthless Southern matriarch who will stop at nothing to get what she wants. Each performance demonstrated her range, her fearlessness, her willingness to play characters who were not always likable, but were always human. She became known as an actress who never took the easy way out, who always chose truth over vanity, who could make you understand a character even when you did not approve of their actions. By the early 1940s, she was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, commanding roles and respect that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. But she never forgot what it had cost to reach that position. And she never stopped being aware of how fragile it all was, how easily it could be taken away. Meanwhile, the conversation she had started continued to grow. The Screen Actors Guild, which had been founded in 1933 to protect actors' interests, began citing Davis's case in internal discussions about contract reform. The Guild's leaders understood that they could not immediately overturn the entire studio system. The major companies were too powerful, their control too entrenched. But they could begin pushing for smaller changes, for limits on the studio's absolute power. Other actors began speaking more openly about the injustices of the contract system. Not everyone had Davis's courage, but her example made it possible to at least voice complaints that previously would have been kept private. The conversation had shifted from "this is just the way things are" to "this is the way things are, but maybe they shouldn't be." And then in 1943, another actress found herself in exactly the situation Davis had faced 7 years earlier. In interviews late in her life, when journalists would ask about her lawsuit against Warner Brothers, she would often minimize its importance. She would say she had been young and impulsive. She would say she had learned valuable lessons from the experience. She would point out that she had lost the case, that the court had ruled against her. But she would also say, sometimes, that it had been necessary. That she could not have lived with herself if she had not tried. That there were principles worth fighting for, even when you knew you would probably lose. She would tell young actors who asked for advice that the most important thing was to never let anyone convince you that you were less than you were. That you had to protect your talent, your integrity, your sense of self. That the industry would try to break you, to mold you into something more convenient, more controllable. And that you had to resist that pressure, even when resistance seemed futile. She died in 1989, at the age of 81, having worked almost until the end. The obituaries recounted her great films, her Academy Awards, her feuds and friendships, her indomitable personality. Many of them mentioned the lawsuit, the quixotic fight against Warner Brothers that had seemed like career suicide but had somehow led to her greatest triumphs. What the obituaries often did not mention was that every actor who negotiated a contract, every artist who fought for creative control, every person who refused to be treated as property, they were all standing on ground that Bette Davis had made sacred with her rebellion. The studios laughed when she sued them. They thought her defeat proved their invincibility. They did not understand that they had lost something more important than a legal case. They had lost the moral high ground. They had lost the unquestioned acceptance of their system. They had lost the silence that had allowed them to operate without scrutiny. Bette Davis did not single-handedly destroy the studio system. No one person could have done that. But she began the conversation that would eventually lead to its collapse. She showed that resistance was possible. She demonstrated that speaking up, even when you lost, could change the terms of the debate. In 1936, when she got on that boat to England, she was a young actress who had won one Academy Award and was struggling to control her career. When she returned, she was something more. She was a symbol, a reminder that dignity mattered more than contracts. That artistic integrity was worth fighting for. That power, even when it seemed absolute, was not invincible. The girl who sued Hollywood and lost taught us all something more valuable than victory. She taught us that courage is not about winning. It is about standing up when everyone tells you to sit down. It is about speaking when everyone tells you to be silent. It is about believing that your truth matters, that your art matters, that your freedom matters, even when the entire weight of an industry tells you otherwise. She taught us that revolutions begin not with success, but with defiance. That change starts when one person looks at an unjust system and says simply no. And that lesson echoes through Hollywood still, through every actor who fights for fair treatment, through every artist who insists on creative control, through every person who refuses to accept that the way things are is the way things must always be. The legacy of Bette Davis's lawsuit extends far beyond the Hollywood contract system. It touches on fundamental questions about labor, dignity, and the relationship between artist and institution. In the decades since her trial, these questions have resurfaced again and again in different industries and different contexts, but always with the same underlying tension between individual autonomy and corporate control. In the 1950s and 1960s, as the studio system finally collapsed under the weight of legal challenges and economic pressures, a new model emerged. Stars became free agents, able to negotiate picture-by-picture deals, to form their own production companies, to exercise genuine control over their careers. This transformation created opportunities that would have seemed impossible in the 1930s, but also created new challenges. The freedom to choose came with the burden of uncertainty. Contract players in the old system had been trapped, yes, but they had also been guaranteed steady work, steady income, steady visibility. The new system offered independence, but also instability. Not every actor thrived in this environment. Davis herself navigated these changes with characteristic determination. In the 1950s, as quality roles became scarcer, she made a decision that shocked many observers. She took out a full-page advertisement in the trade papers, essentially offering her services to any producer who had a good role for her. The ad was straightforward, almost blunt. Mother of 3, 10, 11, and 15 divorcee. American. 30 years experience as an actress in motion pictures. Mobile still, and more affable than rumor would have it. Wants steady employment in Hollywood. Has had Broadway. To some, this seemed like an admission of defeat, a star reduced to begging for work. But Davis saw it differently. She was taking control of her own career, actively seeking opportunities rather than waiting for them to come to her. It was another form of rebellion, another refusal to accept the passive role that aging actresses were expected to play. The advertisement generated enormous publicity and led to several film offers, though not all of them were of the quality she had hoped for. But it kept her working. It kept her visible. And it demonstrated, once again, her willingness to do whatever was necessary to continue practicing her craft. The horror films of the 1960s, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte, represented yet another reinvention. These were not prestige productions. They were lurid, sensationalistic films designed to shock and disturb audiences. But Davis approached them with the same seriousness she had brought to her greatest dramas. In Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, she played a former child star, now middle-aged and delusional, who torments her wheelchair-bound sister in a decaying Hollywood mansion. It was a grotesque role, physically and emotionally demanding. Davis made herself ugly again, as she had in Of Human Bondage 30 years earlier. She wore garish makeup, a blonde wig that looked like a bad joke, baby doll dresses that emphasized her age rather than concealing it. The performance was extraordinary, terrifying and pathetic in equal measure, a portrait of a woman destroyed by early fame and unable to let go of the past. The film was a commercial success and earned Davis her 10th Academy Award nomination. More importantly, it proved that she could still command attention, could still find new ways to challenge audiences, even in material that seemed beneath her. Her co-star in that film was Joan Crawford, another actress from Hollywood's golden age who was struggling to find roles in the changing industry. The two women had a famously difficult relationship, filled with professional jealousy and personal animosity. The tension between them on set was palpable, and director Robert Aldrich used it to enhance the film's atmosphere of mutual hatred. But underneath the rivalry was something else, a shared understanding of what it meant to be a woman in Hollywood, to survive in an industry that valued youth above all else, to keep working when the system was telling you that your time was past. Davis and Crawford were fighting for the same limited opportunities, but they were also fighting the same battle against invisibility. In her later years, Davis became more willing to speak publicly about the struggles she had faced, both personal and professional. She published 2 autobiographies, The Lonely Life in 1962 and that in 1987, that offered candid assessments of her career, her relationships, her regrets. She gave interviews in which she spoke bluntly about the sexism of Hollywood, the difficulty of aging as an actress, the way the industry discarded women who were no longer young and beautiful. She talked about her 4 marriages, all of which had ended in divorce. She talked about the difficulty of balancing career and family, about the guilt she felt as a mother, about the sacrifices she had made, and the costs of those sacrifices. She did not present herself as a victim, but neither did she pretend that her success had come without pain. And increasingly, she talked about the lawsuit, about what it had meant to her, and what she hoped it had meant to the industry. She acknowledged that she had lost in court, but she also pointed out that she had won something more important, the right to be taken seriously, the right to have a voice in her own career. She had shown that resistance was possible, even when the odds were overwhelming. Other actors and actresses who had known Davis, who had worked with her or competed against her, began to speak more openly about her influence. Katharine Hepburn, another actress who had fought for control over her career, called Davis a pioneer. Meryl Streep, from a younger generation, cited Davis as an inspiration, as proof that an actress could be difficult, demanding, uncompromising, and still have a great career. The women's movement of the 1970s and 1980s embraced Davis as a feminist icon, though she herself was ambivalent about that label. She had not thought of herself as fighting for women's rights in 1936. She had simply been fighting for her own rights, for her own dignity, for her own artistic freedom. But she came to understand that individual struggles often had collective implications, that her rebellion had opened doors for others even when that had not been her intention. Film historians and legal scholars began examining her case in greater depth, recognizing its significance in the larger story of Hollywood labor relations. They traced the line from Davis's lawsuit to de Havilland's victory to the eventual collapse of the studio system. They noted that Davis had articulated, perhaps for the first time in such a public way, the fundamental injustice of treating artists as property. The comparison to slavery that her lawyers had made in court, a comparison that had seemed hyperbolic at the time, began to look more apt in retrospect. Not because the material conditions were equivalent, obviously. Davis was well paid and lived comfortably. She was not subjected to physical violence or the horrors of actual slavery. But the underlying principle was similar. One party had virtually unlimited control over another party's life and labor. One party could make all the decisions while the other party had no meaningful power to refuse or negotiate. The studio system had relied on the invisibility of this control. It had worked because actors accepted it as the price of fame, because the public did not scrutinize the contracts too closely, because the legal system treated studio contracts as ordinary employment agreements rather than as instruments of domination. Davis's lawsuit had stripped away that invisibility. It had forced people to look at the contracts, to see exactly what they said and what they meant. And once people saw the terms clearly, it became much harder to defend them as fair or reasonable. This pattern, making injustice visible, forcing public scrutiny, changing the conversation even without changing the immediate outcome, would be repeated in many other contexts over the decades that followed. Civil rights activists, labor organizers, advocates for various causes learned that losing a battle in court or in the legislature did not necessarily mean losing the larger war. Sometimes the act of fighting, of making the issue public, of refusing to accept the status quo, was itself transformative. In Hollywood specifically, the changes that began with Davis's lawsuit continued to accelerate through the latter half of the 20th century. By the 1970s and 1980s, major stars routinely negotiated for profit participation, creative control, director approval, script consultation. They formed their own production companies, developed their own projects, exercised genuine power over their careers. The idea that a studio could simply assign an actor to a film and suspend them if they refused seemed almost medieval. But new forms of control emerged as well. The rise of franchises and cinematic universes in the 1990s and 2000s created a different kind of binding obligation. Actors who signed on for superhero films or other major franchises often committed to multiple films over many years. The terms were generally more favorable than the old studio contracts. The pay was better, the conditions less oppressive. But there were echoes of the old system, situations where actors found themselves locked into roles they no longer wanted to play, unable to pursue other opportunities because of contractual obligations. The conversation that Bette Davis started in 1936 thus remained relevant into the 21st century. The specific terms might change, the legal framework might evolve, but the fundamental tension between artistic freedom and institutional control persisted. And whenever that tension flared up, whenever an actor or director or writer challenged the prevailing system, observers inevitably invoked Davis's name, remembered her courage, drew inspiration from her example. Beyond Hollywood, Davis's story resonated with workers in many different fields. The rise of non-compete clauses, the debates over intellectual property rights, the arguments about gig economy labor practices, all of these echoed, in various ways, the issues Davis had raised in her lawsuit. What rights did workers have over their own labor? What claims could employers make on their time and talent? Where was the line between legitimate business interests and illegitimate control? These were not abstract legal questions. They were questions about human dignity, about the kind of society we wanted to live in, about the balance between freedom and obligation. Davis had not resolved these questions. No single lawsuit could have done that. But she had insisted that they be asked, that they be debated, that they be taken seriously. In 1977, the American Film Institute honored Bette Davis with a Life Achievement Award, only the fifth person and the first woman to receive the award. The ceremony, broadcast on national television, featured tributes from actors, directors, and industry figures spanning generations. They praised her talent, her dedication, her longevity. But many of them also mentioned her courage, her willingness to fight for her principles, her refusal to be controlled. Davis, accepting the award at age 69, was characteristically blunt. She thanked those who had helped her, acknowledged those who had hindered her, and made it clear that she had no intention of retiring. She was still working, still seeking good roles, still refusing to go quietly into the night. She would continue working for another 12 years, taking whatever roles were offered, still trying to find characters worth playing, still believing that acting was the most important thing she could do with her life. The parts were often small. The productions were sometimes cheap, but she approached each one with professionalism, trying to find something real even in mediocre material. Her final film, Wicked Stepmother, was released in 1989, shortly before her death. It was not a good film. Davis herself knew it was not good. She withdrew from the production partway through filming, one of the few times in her career she had walked away from a project. But even that decision, recognizing when something was not worth finishing, was a form of artistic integrity, a refusal to waste her final energies on work that did not matter. When she died in October 1989, the obituaries and tributes poured in from around the world. Presidents and prime ministers issued statements. The Hollywood community mourned one of its greatest stars. Film festivals and retrospectives celebrated her work. Critics wrote long assessments of her career, her technique, her influence. But perhaps the most meaningful tributes came from working actors, not the famous stars, but the journeymen and women, the character actors, the people making a living in film and television without achieving superstardom. They wrote letters to newspapers, posted memories on early internet forums, told stories about how Davis's example had inspired them to persevere, to fight for better treatment, to believe that their work mattered. These were the people who understood most viscerally what Davis had fought for. They lived with the everyday indignities of the entertainment industry, the disrespect, the exploitation, the constant pressure to compromise. They knew what it meant to stand up for yourself in a system designed to break you down. And they knew that Davis had done it first, had shown that it was possible. In the decades since her death, Davis's reputation has only grown. Film scholars consistently rank her among the greatest actresses in cinema history. Her performances are studied in acting classes, analyzed in academic papers, celebrated in retrospectives. All About Eve, Jezebel, Dark Victory, now Voyager. These films remain classics, still watched and admired more than half a century after they were made. But it is the lawsuit that gives her story its deeper meaning, that transforms her from merely a great actress into something more, a symbol of resistance, a reminder of the cost of artistic freedom, an example of how individual courage can change institutional structures. The studios laughed when she sued them. They thought her defeat proved that the system was unassailable, that actors would always be subordinate to corporate power. They were wrong. The laughter died away as the system they thought was permanent began to crumble. And when historians look back to understand how that transformation happened, they pointed to a young woman on a boat to England, willing to sacrifice everything for a principle. Bette Davis never claimed to be a revolutionary. She insisted throughout her life that she had simply been trying to do good work, to play interesting roles, to practice her craft with integrity. The larger implications of her actions were, in her view, almost accidental. But history is full of revolutions that began with individuals who were not trying to change the world, who were simply trying to live according to their own values. The woman who refuses to give up her seat on a bus. The worker who organizes a union. The artist who insists on creative freedom. These small acts of defiance, repeated across time and place, create the conditions for larger transformations. Bette Davis got on a boat to England in 1936 because she could no longer accept the terms of her bondage. She lost her lawsuit. She returned to Hollywood humiliated and broke. But she had shown that resistance was possible. She had demonstrated that even powerless people could say no. She had proven that the system, for all its might, could be challenged. And that lesson, that simple, profound lesson, has echoed down through the decades, inspiring countless others to stand up, to speak out, to refuse the unacceptable. Not always successfully, not without cost, but with the knowledge that the fight itself matters, that bearing witness to injustice is itself a form of resistance, that losing with dignity is better than winning through surrender. In the end, that is the legacy of the girl who sued Hollywood. Not the films she made, as brilliant as they were. Not the awards she won, as well-deserved as they were. But the courage she showed in a moment when courage seemed futile. The willingness to fight when everyone told her to submit. The refusal to accept that power, simply because it was power, deserved obedience. She changed Hollywood not through her victory, but through her defiance. She changed the industry not by winning her case, but by making people see what the system really was. She changed history not because she succeeded, but because she tried. And somewhere, perhaps, in a young actor reading a contract and questioning its terms, in an artist refusing to compromise their vision, in a worker standing up for their dignity, somewhere the revolution Bette Davis started continues still. The studio executives laughed when she sued them. They stopped laughing when they realized what she had begun. She had begun the end of their world, and the beginning of a new one.